All right, welcome back, everybody. We're finally here. It's almost the end of the year. Not sure if this is going to be the last video I post or not, but we have finally reached the 80s. We finally reached the 80s. This is going to be a kind of softball one, this first video I post. The next one I expect it to take on more topics of greater gravity. Not that this one is not. This one's going to focus more on domestic history during the 1980s. All right, so let's get on with it. I think front and center. uh, every grandparent's hero, at least here in Miami. Ronald Reagan becomes the 40th president of the United States. Republican. Uh, the last Republican to be in the White House was Ford, but technically he wasn't elected. The last Republican to be elected to the White House was Nixon. Um, and Nixon himself, took a while to get there. So Ronald Reagan, if you don't know, was a former actor, former president of the Screen Actors Guild. Um, During the McCarthy trials, he took a very anti-communist stance and ratted out several members in the industry to the House Un-American Activities Committee. Became involved in politics in the 60s, eventually becoming the governor of California. Didn't care too much for the counterculture or the Black Panthers. After the Black Panthers staged an armed protest at the California legislature, he signed the Mumford Act into law, which banned the open carry of guns. That's an interesting thing to talk about, given recent events. He was a big fan of Barry Goldwater's. Already, he was trying to run for president, if I'm not mistaken, in the 70s. A big fan of Barry Goldwater. Big fan of the idea that big government is bad, and that programs like Medicare, Medicaid were all, creeping socialism. I mean, he's pretty much on the record for that. So pretty hardcore on the right, both in terms of foreign policy, taking it to the Soviets. In fact, he's very hawkish. He's interesting because his first 4 years it's a very hawkish position that he takes on foreign policy. Um, yeah, so let's another thing to address. Ronald Reagan's very much a neoconservative in the sense he is he he literally takes on the mantle of this new type of conservative that was just taking shape and form after World War II. Both what they love to call themselves fiscally responsible, not a big fan of the New Deal, much less the Great Society of what they would consider to be reckless government spending on the teat of the government and what they call, reckless government spending when others have to pay the tab. In other words, the more talented, the more hardworking, you're punishing success by taxing the successful, or only to prop up those that are lazy and don't. That's the narrative. That's a almost cult-like belief system. That's neocons. So it was this marriage of highly interventionist, highly aggressive, hawkish position against the Soviet Union, a rejection of détente, and at the same time, a very hostile position against the New Deal, and even more so the Great Society, and any propping up of any welfare state, as they would see it, supporting the lazy at the expense of the successful, the job creators, and this is a belief system that exists even till today. It starts with Barry Goldwater. Nixon takes it to a certain level, but Nixon is not the chosen one. The chosen one comes in the form of Ronald Reagan. He is the manifestation of the conservative backlash against what they saw was the liberal excesses of the JFK, Lyndon B. Johnson administration. So we're just going to talk about domestics today, all right? And we're going to do a lot of focusing on the economy. So let's look at this slide for a second. This is the situation that Ronald Reagan walks into. High prices, high unemployment. Okay, why was there high unemployment? Because there was high prices, driving up the cost of business, and how what businesses did when the cost of business became expensive. Chief reason, energy, was cut costs, and the number one way of cutting costs was to let go of people, which exasperated the unemployment problem. So you had this situation in which prices were high and unemployment was high as well. And if you remember, let's see if I can manipulate our graph here. Okay, these lines right here. Let's pick another color. Okay. This would be aggregate supply. That means the total of all goods and services that a society could produce at a given time. Right? And then over here, it counteracts with what they call aggregate demand, the total uh, demand for goods and services society may have at a particular moment. That's dependent on how much money society has at its disposal, right? Now, what happens when you introduce external factors, like, for example, uh, energy, energy costs going up, either because of a deliberate cut in production or unexpected cut in production. They pass that cost on to everything else. In the 70s PowerPoint, I go into greater detail what happened. Well, then, when it becomes harder for supply to keep pace with demand, they have to make cuts. Then you're going to end up with a new aggregate supply line. Okay. Now, what happens here, if you remember, look at these two intersects. Supply line, aggregate supply actually contracts. Okay. Aggregate supply contracts, and in contracting, it gives us a new intersect point. In this new intersect point, prices have gone up from the original, and employment has dropped. And when employment drops, economic growth, economic activity drops as well. The Keynesian uh, formula is, employment is tied to economic activity. More employment, more activity. Less employment, less activity. And all of that is tied to economic growth. So I want you to take a good look at this graph. This is a situation that Reagan comes into. How does he propose to fix it? Now, we didn't talk about this in the Carter administration, but already towards the end of Carter, he's starting to take steps that are deviating from, if you remember, that the compromise between government and business. As long as we keep money, flowing into the banks, and have an easy money, make enough money available to borrow at low interest rates, you'll keep people employed. Well, it's the Carter administration starts to walk away from that. The idea is, if we have so much money out there, and that's why the dollars are weak, if we contract the money supply, okay, it may strengthen the dollar. And in strengthening the dollar, okay, companies will get, more for what they produce, in terms of real purchasing price, and will not have to cut costs so much, and it will help at least bring down prices. And it brings down prices, and then businesses could bounce back up again. And so what Carter does in this last year is he starts increasing interest rates. He tells the Fed to start increasing interest rates. Now, this is a double-edged sword, okay? When you start increasing interest rate, that is a toolbox that the Fed has to cool down the price of money, okay? If I start raising interest rates, I'm going to start discouraging people that otherwise would have been willing to borrow money at lower rates. So I'm going to start seeing, depending on how high I raise the interest, which they went pretty high, folks. I heard they went all the way, if I'm not mistaken, I don't have it in front of me, 12, 13, 14, 15%. You raise interest rates, people that would have borrowed otherwise are not going to, because in the long run, they're going to end up paying much more. What happens? People will not buy homes like they did before. Businesses will not expand like they did before. People will not simply not borrow to finance their consumption like they did before. So you're going to see a drop. Yes, you're going to cool down. You're going to take dollars out of circulation. And I'm going to explain to you how this works by raising the interest rate. But you're going to discourage further investment. You're going to discourage further spending. Okay. Now, whether that's good or that's bad, it's debatable. Um, but when I raise interest rates, the one that benefits from that are investors. Because now instead of investing in companies that frankly are seeing their bottom line shrink because they're cutting production, you put it in bonds. Okay? So I'm not going to want to make, I'm not going to want to get into a 30-year loan at a 12% interest rate. But I will buy a government bond that is paying 12%. You understand? So I may not want to borrow at a moment of high interest rates, but I do want to invest. I want to invest in bonds. And that's how the government takes money out of circulation. The more people buy these government bonds, think of the exchange. They're handing the government the cash. They're getting a piece of paper in return that could mature in 10, 15, 20 years. But in the meantime, the government took money out of circulation. The more money the government takes out of circulation by selling bonds at a very attractive interest rate, okay, that shrinks the money supply and inherently strengthens, undergirds support to the dollar that is out there, okay, that helps regulate prices, bring them back down again, or at least keep them from going up, cuts down the cost of business, and then maybe businesses will be able to bounce up. But it was done too late in that fourth year. Um, if you want to look at Paul Volcker, the chairman of the Fed that Carter brought in, it was done too late in that last year to have much of an effect. And so here comes Reagan. All right, so let me erase this stuff. Heaven forbid, I don't want it to show up in the next PowerPoint. And Reagan, the neoconservative that he is, okay, understand a lot of this happens under the overall mantra. The reason why we are in the problem that we are today is because government has gotten too big. Government spending is out of control, okay? The bigger government it is, the more it infringes on our freedoms. So solution number one, we got to make government smaller. If we make government smaller, government spends less. That means we're going to have to ask less money from people, therefore taxes. We tax people less, and instead they'll take that money that they've earned and spend it out in the market the way they wish, and then businesses will benefit. The other mantra is, and it goes hand in hand with shrinking the government, private is better than public. And we saw this with Nixon's new federalism. Reagan takes Nixon's new federalism, the idea that states' rights are important once again, but now it's the new gift wrapping about we have to do something about big government. Let's take money that the federal government otherwise would have collected and spent and handed over to the states. So Reagan's going to continue that and take it even further, okay? And it still very much exists today. I mean, it is the driving force behind why private prisons exist, why HMOs exist, why charter schools exist. A lot of people still buy into the idea that if it's privately run and therefore there's a profit motive that drives that enterprise, somehow it will be run better, more efficiently, and produce better results for the consumer. Highly, highly debatable. Highly, highly debatable, but still very, very much believed by many Americans today. So Reaganomics, that's the rollout. We are going to resolve this problem that was started by LBJ. The blame is put on the Great Society. And neither Nixon nor Ford nor Carter were able to fix because they didn't go after it more aggressively. Reagan's economic mentor, is a guy named Milton Friedman from the Chicago School of the University of Chicago Department of Economics. Um, and Friedman's all about privatization. Friedman's all about reducing the size of the government and handing out what otherwise would have been the function of government to a private enterprise, and to gradually privatize all of the function that government used to regard as public, eventually putting it in private hands. Long story short, how, think of that graph that I just showed you. Reagan's plan to fix the economy is to help the supply side. Help the supply side, and in return, whatever gains that the supply side makes eventually are going to trickle down to the demand side, which are consumers. This is trickle-down economics. If you help out business, if you help out the wealthy, if you help out the rich and powerful, with what, Mr. Hernandez? By lowering their taxes, okay? By cutting down on regulation, by giving them more uh, space, if you will, by which to operate without interference from the government or having to pay taxes, they'll be more profitable, and all of this will trickle down to everybody else. Okay, I try to be as objective as possible, but that is a myth. We gave it a try in '80. Here we are. What would that be? 40 years later? Myth. Myth. Because somewhere along the way, there's no way that you could tell me mechanically that lowering taxes for the most wealthy, lowering taxes for corporations somehow will equal more jobs and higher wages, because it does not. What they're going to do is going to take that money and they're going to put it into the hands of shareholders to attract even more investments, or they're going to take it out of the country and put it in tax shelters, in tax havens, so they don't have to pay taxes on it. And the average American will not see a benefit in terms of wages or in the quality of jobs. But let's stick to the 1980s. He's going to lower taxes. He's going to decrease the size of government, which in itself is a shell game. Okay? Because you get very ideological. When we talk about, when you're asking supporters of Reagan, yeah, let's cut parts of government. What are they going to say? Yeah, public education and public assistance and public housing and the SNAP program and basically anything that could possibly help the poor and minorities. Cut the military? No, heaven forbid. Cut law enforcement? Cut our prison system? Heaven forbid. We're not cutting that. In fact, they'd spend more on that. And that's the interesting. How do you pour billions and billions and billions of dollars into military spending when at the same time you've pledged not to increase taxes, but on the contrary, to lower them? Easy. You start running the country on a credit card. That's called deficit spending. The public at the moment is not paying taxes, but the government is still spending. And to make supporters of Reagan happy, the government starts to reduce spending in all of these programs and shift all that money to the military, into the penal system. Okay? More local and state control rather than federal control. Again, a shell game. Government never shrank under Reagan. It didn't really. The federal government didn't really shrink because most government spending was taken away from social programs and put in the hands of the military. Okay. But what they also did is, to make it seem that the federal government shrunk, they took all that money that otherwise would have gone to federally funded, federally managed social programs and gave it to the states. So the federal government looked like it was shrinking, especially if you're only looking at social spending. But in actuality, the state governments were expanding in size because the federal government was basically saying, here, take some money, you take care of that program. And of course, deregulation. If we get rid of regulation, things like environmental regulation, things like occupational safety and hazards, government businesses will not have that weighing them down, and they'll be free to open up and I guess do business more freely. And somehow this will lead to larger profit margins, and all that success will trickle down. And the industries that Reagan's really looking at to deregulate is banking and the airline industry. So what do Reaganomics actually end up doing? And he doesn't really bring inflation back to sustainable numbers, 4 or 5%, until about his second term. He doesn't reverse the trend on unemployment till about his second term. But you have to look between the lines. That's why these numbers sometimes are worthless. Is Reagan able to reverse the trend on unemployment and start create jobs? Yes, he does. What kind of jobs? It's not the union-backed manufacturing jobs that you would find in a Ford or a Chrysler plant in Detroit. But when they when they crunch the unemployment jobs, the auto plant manufacturing job and a job at Walmart counts 1 for 1. Oh, one job was lost and another job was created. But you know damn well those two jobs are not equal. They don't pay the same, they don't offer the same benefits, and they certainly don't offer the same job security. But on paper, yes, the inflation and the unemployment trend were reversed under Reagan. Reagan made cuts to government spending, particularly social spending. You know, he couldn't go after Medicare and Social Security as easily because they're funded somewhat differently. Okay, they're more of an entitlement, as in people pay into them. He cut income taxes and capital gains taxes. Capital gains taxes is how much you make on an asset that you own and you flip. How much taxes do you have to pay on the appreciation that comes up when you sell this asset? That's why you have, multimillionaires saying, "Look, I don't receive 1 penny for being the CEO of my corporation." Oh my God, what a nice guy! It doesn't matter because you make most of your income, okay, through your dividends, as in your cut of the profit that you receive per share that you own. Here's the trick, okay? Income, labor is taxed anywhere between, depending on what your income is, 20, 25, 30%. But assets, that's where capital gains comes from, are taxed in the teens. So of course, I don't accept the penny for the job I do as CEO. I receive all my money off of, the dividends that I collect from my portfolio. And I'm only paying, if I haven't found a loophole on the way, I'm only paying, 10, 15% tax on that. He did cut regulations on businesses, okay? And he did cut down on the expansion of the money supply. Then again, that kind of started with Carter, not really with Reagan. In the long run, taxes were lowered, but this really benefited the extremely wealthy more than anybody else, okay? And, I used to teach macro. We could go into, okay, and then what is exactly the bang for the buck when you lower taxes? Okay, you let people keep more of their tax dollars in their pocket. They're going to go out and spend it more. Okay, and that's true to an extent. A working class family, you give them money, or other words, you give them back money that they paid to you, and they're going to go spend it. But if I'm, sorry to use a contemporary situation, but you take trillionaire Jeff Bezos, and and you hand him back a significant portion of the taxes he paid, which ironically he didn't. What's he going to use that money for? He has so much money. Is he really going to spend it, or is he going to hoard it somewhere? He's cut spending on social services. Very importantly, a lot of the social services that were targeted towards the mentally ill. But by doing so, you still got to run a government. So how can you keep up the charade of, look, everybody, I'm lowering taxes. You should be happy about that. And by doing so, I'm shrinking the size of government. Oh, but by the way, you still need to have government, particularly the type of government with guns that protects you. And so the way you pull that off is you run up a deficit. $221 billion, a deficit. How's that happen? It happens through government spending that wasn't collected through taxes, but was paid for through IOUs, basically on a credit card, for other generations to pay. There's a gamble. If the economy grows, you're in a better position to pay it off. In the end, we end up with because these tax cuts and the New Society and the War on Poverty, for all of its critique, did an incredible job at lowering the rate of poverty in this country. Nixon is the first one that had at it by getting rid of one of its most important programs. So when you cut programs that help alleviate poverty, but you cut taxes, and the way you cut taxes does more to benefit the extremely wealthy than the poor, then don't be surprised that a gap starts to open up. And when those that saved money due to lower taxes, businesses, and the incredibly wealthy, when there is no pressure on them to invest that money into expanding their businesses, expanding jobs, paying more, but instead they put it into the dividends of shareholders to attract even more investors, wages don't grow. Adjusted for real dollars, wages in this country have not grown since the 1970s. They've been the same, if not actually dropped. Oh, but mister, I make $10 an hour, in 2020. Yeah, big deal. And in 1988, you made $5 an hour, which means wages doubled, but prices, believe me, did more than simply double. And all these federal programs were shifted to the states. Our trade deficit, since the manufacturing jobs left, we're doing less manufacturing, therefore less exporting, but we still require goods, manufactured goods. That means we became slowly a country that imported more than it exported. And that worked fantastically well. Because what did corporations start doing? In order to cut on cost even more so, salvage the bottom line. Salvage the bottom line, you could hand out even more money to investors, finding cheaper places to manufacture. So the Detroits start going to the south and opening up in Alabamas and Georgias where they don't have to mess with the unions. And even that's not good enough because there is a minimum wage in this country. Okay, and then they start finding, other places, to Mexico and ultimately to China. And so, mister, if it's true that wages haven't gone up since the 70s, how have we been able to afford the consumer abundance that we have? Easy. Okay? Because most of the stuff that you buy is made elsewhere, and it's made elsewhere because of the much cheaper labor cost. Hence, your, by comparison, lower wages could still buy a significant amount of goods if these goods are made overseas in places where the labor cost is a fraction of what exists in the United States. And then, that outsourcing is what led to what was left of our manufacturing economy to be replaced by a service oriented one. And so we end up importing more than we export. We still export, though. A lot of people take this too far. The United States, I think, is either number 2 or number 3 in the world as an exporter. We're not the Dutch, and we're not the Germans, and we're certainly not the Chinese. But we're one of the world's top exporters. The problem is we don't export consumer goods. We tend to export bulk agricultural goods. We tend to export defense goods. Saudi Arabia buys billions of dollars worth of U.S. defense goods every year. Airplanes, construction equipment, but not a pair of tennis shoes that says made in the USA. So that's why a lot of people, they missed the boat on that one. And as you can see, you can compare, we have to speed it up, but you can stop this PowerPoint. You can compare the interest rate. This is not an economics class, so I'm not going to, what's the difference between a prime rate? Prime rate is the lowest possible interest rate you could find. 1981, 20%. 2009, 3.2. Inflation was brought down dramatically. The jobless rate was brought down as well, but we have to ask these questions, of what jobs. And the interest rate on the 30-year mortgage. So, did it set out what it aimed to do? Lower inflation, lower unemployment? Yes, it did. But it brought with it other consequences, inequality. And think about also, if your wages don't buy what they used to, because for real dollars, you're not really getting paid what a family was being paid 40 years ago, that's fine because the lower interest rate encourages consumer debt. This is kind of a meme, but yes, one of the first things that Reagan did, Reagan was able to convince a lot of unions at the time to back him. A lot of unions abandoned, class struggle and replaced it with nationalism. Buy American was the slogan, right? We're all Americans. American labor, okay, should be on the same team as, the Reagan administration that wants to put America first. Sound familiar, right? Until you get your first significant strike of air traffic controllers in 1981. And this was a union that supported Reagan's presidency. Most of the unions did. Yes, Republican unions. Why not? Who do you think was behind the hard hat riots? And how did Reagan thank them for support? Since you're affecting air traffic in this country, the multi-billion-dollar industry that it is, you either go to work or I'm going to have you all fired and arrested and replaced with military air traffic controllers. And just like that, Reagan introduced another key ingredient of Reaganomics, union busting, which started with Nixon. The other way to get competitive, the other way to help the supply side, is we're going to have to break the unions in this country. And Nixon started, and Reagan is going to carry this forward as well. A former union president himself. And this is one of the most dramatic examples of breaking a union, when the president himself is threatening to fire and replace all the striking air traffic controllers. I don't know if Reagan was necessarily the only cause behind this, but when you got high interest rates on mortgages, coupled with high unemployment, a lot of people are going to be left homeless. And that's homelessness driven by economic factors. But when you start taking away federal funding for mental health programs, when you start taking away federal funding for housing with people with disabilities or low income, then you start ending up with people on the streets. That's one of the strange side effects of capitalism. Plenty of houses, but people living, how do you explain the wealthiest country in the world? People living on sidewalks. And a significant number of these people, when this crisis begins to emerge, are people that were let go at whatever institution or mental health facility was taking care of them because the funding wasn't there. If you've seen the movie Joker, they address this issue and they place it more or less in the time that it happened. Due to cuts in federal low-income housing programs and mental health care facilities, homelessness rose to 1.2 million by late 80s. And I remember here in Miami, whenever we would have a big event, hosting a summit of all the presidents of Latin America. This happened, I think, like in '89. What did what did the city fathers do? Decided to pick up all those homeless people and put them in the Dade County jail. So when all these presidents from all Latin America flew into Miami, they didn't see this. And if you don't see it, it doesn't exist. Then the big one, and I wish I had more time, but we're running out of time. Um, just like now in 2020, Ronald Reagan, um, his presidency would be rattled by a significant pandemic um, that is in the 1980s just starting to emerge, and nobody understood. But the way the Reagan administration dealt with it ended up being very callous and would end up costing the lives of many people. And this is AIDS, acquired immune deficiency syndrome, which in your health class, I imagine you've heard, this is a sexually transmitted disease of the worst kind because this one actually kills you. In the beginning, nobody really knew what it was. It seemed like a very strange case of pneumonia. Then they started to extrapolate, the group that it was happening to most often. And before you know it, they made the link to bodily fluids and the transference of bodily fluids being behind the transference of this virus from one person to another. And hence, in the body unable to fight this virus because in the body it mutates so rapidly that the body's own immune system cannot combat it. And the Reagan administration's first approach was to ignore it. And then unfortunately, mostly from the right, after you couldn't ignore it anymore, they tried to diminish it by saying, well, this is only a gay person's disease. This is only a gay person's disease. This is only the disease that affects intravenous drug users. And since most of us are not gay or intravenous drug users, and some of the worst voices out there were claiming that this was God's punishment, etc., etc. So I'll just read the caption to you. By February 1st, 1983, 1,025 AIDS cases reported, and at least 394 had died in the U.S. Reagan said nothing. 1 year later, 1984, is the last year of his first term. The CDC announced 4,177 reported cases and 1,807 deaths. So you're talking about almost a 50% death rate. The others are going to die too. Finally, May 31st, 1987, 2 years into his second term, with 36,000 Americans diagnosed and almost 21,000 dead, and the disease having spread to 113 countries with more than 50,000 cases, it's at that point that Reagan publicly recognized the existence of an AIDS epidemic. But that's only after having ignored it or diminished its importance by saying it was a gay disease for a significant number of years. Okay, so those were many years lost that the CDC could have had the resources to begin educating the public, et cetera, et cetera. And were they right about being a gay or an intravenous drug user's disease? Not at all. They were not right. Okay, it eventually found its way into general population. Reagan's also responsible for taking Nixon's war on drugs and putting it on steroids, which is another drug, ironically, by introducing mandatory sentencing. Nixon criminalized the use, possession, manufacture, distribution of what the federal government called it narcotics. And remember, they have it by schedules. And marijuana and heroin were Schedule 1. Reagan introduces the federal policy of mandating mandatory sentencing. Okay, taking away from judges the ability to use a judge's discretion. What ends up happening? The prison population in this country begins to skyrocket and takes us to where we are today. The number one imprisoner of human beings on the planet, 25% of the world's inmates, are in American prisons. We can think about how this has ravaged those communities most affected by this war on drugs. And yes, Nancy Reagan, she put out a public education campaign to just say no, tell kids not to use drugs, etc., etc. Um, but at the same time, you are ravaging communities that are being policed and targeted more often than others. For years, we had incredible discrepancies in how drugs were punished. Remember, cocaine was not Schedule 1. So you were getting people receiving hefty, hefty sentences for marijuana possession and slaps on the hand for cocaine possession. Cocaine having become the number one drug in this country at the time. And cocaine-derived drugs, which we're going to talk about soon. And you basically start to depopulate entire communities of potential fathers and uncles and male role models, having them put in jail instead. And this is the same pattern until after happened after Reconstruction. The more bodies you have in prison, the more bodies you could use for free labor. And that's how we get here. Cocaine for most of the 70s and mostly for most of the 80s, for the most part being a privileged man's drug, very expensive, being derived from the coca leaf. But how do we expand our market share? Okay. How do we expand cocaine into a community whose income could not afford cocaine at the market prices that existed in the 80s? You produce a cheap, much more dangerous derivative of cocaine. There's cocaine in it. Okay. It is the active ingredient, if you will, but it is not the only ingredient in there. Hence emerged a incredibly highly addictive and dangerous drug in the 1980s that ravaged communities, crack. That's what it was called on the street. Okay? There's cocaine in it, but there's also a lot of other nonsense in it as well. Highly addictive, very fast high, but people were chasing that high constantly, and it turns people. I mean, first you had heroin, and when the heroin kind of drifts away, it is replaced by crack, and it absolutely destroys communities. And we're going to talk later on about how the federal government might have helped bring crack into the United States, particularly into our low-income neighborhoods. And if crack itself wasn't killing people and making them do awful things, um, just to chase that high, um, the violence that the entire crack trade generated was producing just as much harm as well. So yes, the 1980s, and particularly in our mostly minority inner city communities in this country, crack just absolutely, the crack epidemic absolutely ravaged these places. You know, you found cocaine in the suburbs, and then you would have these strange laws that if you were caught with crack, you could expect to serve more time in prison than with cocaine, even though strangely enough, there was more cocaine in pure cocaine than there was in crack. And it has to do with class. Because who was using cocaine? The stockbrokers, the bankers, the judges, the attorneys. Okay? They're protecting their interests. And lives were ruined. I mean, we have very similar situations now. There's people still rotting in jail on marijuana convictions while people from a more privileged segment of American society are making fortunes off the same thing. Better hurry up. All right. Hollywood in the 1980s. Iconic films. Oh, look, all down there, Scarface. But I'm sure you've all heard of these. Action movies, over-the-top action movies with Sylvester Stallone and Arnold Schwarzenegger kind of dominated the field. Teenage movies with Molly Ringwald. So what do we have here? Back to the Future, Ghostbusters, E.T., Aliens, Terminator, Breakfast Club, Die Hard, Ferris Bueller, Raiders of the Lost Ark, Gremlins, Shining, Blade Runner, Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure, Top Gun, Goonies, Fast Times at Ridgemont High, Nightmare on Elm Street, and Scarface. All were iconic 1980s films that would leave their thumbprint on American culture. So now we're going to go into the culture of the 1980s. So, things got a little bit more advanced. The transistor radio gave way to the Sony Walkman. The cassette became the new medium by which to record audio. Video games, the video arcade. Listen. Just watch Stranger Things. Just watch Stranger Things. Stranger Things is accurate. Believe me, I know. I was about the age of the characters on Stranger Things. Stranger Things is absolutely accurate. They do a very good job with that. Rubik's Cube. Top artists at the time would have been Madonna, Prince, and Michael Jackson, absolutely. Embarrassing hairstyles, a lot of gel, a lot of teasing hair. And of course, the mullet, which was perhaps more common than it should have been. And that's not actually the first computer, but it's a step in the direction that you know. That's an Apple Macintosh. So here's a fun fact you may not know. The Windows operating system first showed up on an Apple when Bill Gates and Steve Jobs were working together. And then Bill Gates stole the idea of a Windows-based operating system and went off and founded Microsoft. Those guys backstab each other all the time. The video arcade, you know? Not that there wasn't consoles at home, but your console could never give you the quality, the playability of an arcade game at the time. And it was 25 cents, which is crazy because you go to Chuck E. Cheese today, and it's still 25 cents. It's 25 cents. And the arcades became all the rage, as did shopping malls. So, just watch Stranger Things. At the time, WWF, now called WWE, was very popular. Maybe all middle school kids. Wrestling, professional wrestling, finally got prime time. For people in Miami, Miami Vice was a show that kind of brought Miami back into the limelight. Miami was experiencing a number of interesting years. Okay. A number of interesting years because Miami became a hub, if you will, of much of the drug traffic entering into the United States. A lot of real estate. So like I said, I would have shown you at this point documentary Cocaine Cowboys. If you wish to on your own, you should. That's like one of those, like everybody should see that. That's just an issue of cultural literacy. Cable TV started to emerge. That means you paid for TV, and then you ended up with channels like MTV, who, believe it or not, once upon a time showed videos. That was all they showed, which in itself revolutionized the music industry. And now the recording artist had to not just be an audio artist. The recording artist now had to be a visual artist. And some artists made that transfer, and some of them didn't. And then, of course, the beginning of sneaker culture. The beginning of sneaker culture with, I don't know if the Jordans were the ones that started this. We'll leave it at that. All right. And then three musical genres that were born in the early to mid 70s in New York City finally reached the mainstream and finally become nationwide cultural phenomenon in their own. Okay, and we kind of talked about this in the 70s. I was going to do a separate PowerPoint. Hip hop becomes mainstream, becomes American popular music. Okay, Hip hop was born in 1973. Okay, hip hop was born. The father of hip hop was DJ Kool Herc. And where did hip hop was born from? Kool Herc had this idea of taking two turntables, two records of the same song, and the music he would look for were music that had, for the most part, soul and funk music that had a particular beat to it. And instead of letting the beat finish, he would stop it on one record and then continue the beat on the other by switching the audio channels from one turntable to the next. And then when the beat finished there, he would, with his hands, wind back on the original record. And so you were able to play one beat continuously by switching from one record to the other manually. Okay? And he holds his first party in September of 1917 in the Bronx, and that's how hip hop is born. Later on, you have people like Grandmaster Flash that uses the 808 machine to introduce sampling, African Bambaataa, and before you know it, it is a cultural phenomenon. It's not just music, it's graffiti, it's break dancing. That's where break dancing came from. That's where b-boys and b-girls, okay, would break dance. That means they danced to those break beats that were being played on two turntables. And then scratching comes later on. So look, this old guy talk about, this is the birth of hip hop, okay? That came from gang culture, okay? And somehow the violence of gang culture was somehow translated into this cultural phenomenon, okay? It was music, but it was also music, it was dancing, a lot of elements of gymnastics in that dancing, and graffiti, and et cetera, et cetera. The first MC, I think his name was Coke La Rock, just within a couple of years, you know, he's freestyling. He's the first one. We also, out of New York, punk emerge. And then punk, when it becomes more mainstream, more pop, and it loses its angry edge, punk is actually going to be more successful in Great Britain. It's born in the United States, but then it moves over to Great Britain, and you have groups like the Sex Pistols and whatnot. And in the U.S., it kind of becomes more softened up a bit, and a lot of it becomes what we basically call the new wave music of the 1980s. So Talking Heads also came out of CBGB. Blondie becomes more of a pop group. Devo, and then who else do we have there? Because in Britain they were producing a lot of the same music. Bow Wow Wow, and I forgot the name of that one, and then Billy Idol, and the B-52s, and, well, barely see those. I think that image might have been too small.